4 prime ministers in 20 months. What would be different about a 5th?
That is, I think, the question everyone's asking. And, I think the biggest question, as I heard from the previous correspondence here, is, which party can one even recruit from? We're hearing from Marine Le Pen, who's saying it's an obligation to dissolve the parliament. So, of course, she has her position. I've been reading that, the party leader for the Socialists is kind of angling for it. There have been many other, kind of the further left is saying that they will automatically vote, sent to censure the next prime minister. So, I mean, it's an open question. And yeah, I wish I could read some tea leaves here, but I fear that we're going to be dealing with more of the same.
Mm-hmm. Professor, in every iteration of this, there's always the question of the threat of the far right. Marine Le Pen on ice until she has some decision-making, some guidance from the appeals court about a 2027 run. Not enough confidence in Jordan Bardella. Is the national rally still a threat the way it was when Michel Barnier was ousted?
I think that's been the most kind of interesting point of this moment, to see that Marine Le Pen has shifted her discourse a little bit away from calling on Macron to, resign, because it's not in her interest for Macron to resign right now, because then she couldn't run. So, she's leaving it much more in a parliamentary domain. I think she's still very much focusing on, now that we know the appeals trial will be in January of 26, she's looking at a longer term game here. I'm seeing from kind of man on the street interviews of National Front or National Rally voters that they do want a new election, but that, now Marine Le Pen has to balance, some of the more kind of populist voters who want to disrupt the system with the more stable, market-focused, business community that has been less excited about her candidacy. And so, does she tilt the cart now in order to, impose her party, or does she hold her cards closer for a longer trajectory? It looks like that's where she's leaning right now, because it plays in her interest. But it's true that there is a, sort of groundswell from a certain fraction of society looking for change. It may have come up a little earlier, but there's supposed to be a massive day of rallies on Wednesday that was planned before this vote. So there is this block everything movement announced. They're calling for tractors, to block the roads, and it's throughout France. And so, it's like, how is that going to play in? Do we have a new yellow vest movement? Is that going to mobilize or, kind of detract attention from this? I don't know.
Interesting. Well, when we consider what's about to happen, and you're pointing to Wednesday, which I'm very curious to see how this all plays out, Bayrou's obsession with cutting debt is what got us to this point. What would be the winning message for a successful prime minister?
I think that's the question that, I wish I had the answer again. It sounds like I'm hearing a lot of criticism on Macron for his tax cuts to the wealthy, while also then proposing cuts to social services. So it sounds, like a lot of the debate is still going back to Macron in a way that the prime minister may not have as much control over. But in terms of, where does that leave us for the future? The prime minister will need to look at, what does the budget do with, defense spending? That's been a big topic, that impacts the Franco-American relationship. He needs to figure out, how do we balance Social Security reimbursements and retirement ages? So these are all different moving parts that have a negative impact on the budget. And I think that was Bayrou's point from the start. One of the surprising moments from his speech this morning was that he kind of altered the figure on France's overarching, national debt by adding, it went from 3.3 trillion to 3.4 trillion. So he's, kind of trying to play this responsibility card, but showing that, this is a very serious problem that no one has managed to solve. And, it's going to force a lot of really hard reckoning. There's been a lot of criticism that, one proposal was to cancel 2 holidays, one day from Easter and then from May 8th. Is that going to be enough to change France's economy? Hard to see that playing in, that doesn't play well with anyone, really.
Professor, did Bayrou have a choice here? He decided to pull the trigger on this himself.
Right. I think that is one of the most interesting aspects of this moment that, I'm coming back here in similar circumstances, but the details are actually very different, where Barnier was kind of solicited, he went through the executive orders style of budget negotiations, and then his government fell as a kind of punishment for that. Bayrou was doing something very different. He said from the start, this is a problem. Debt needs to be dealt with. Rise up to your responsibilities and do something about it. And so he is going out in a very different posture from some of the previous governments that have fallen. I found myself thinking that it was an interesting gesture that, he was challenging the delegates to live up to what he considered, a responsibility as elected officials. I'm not sure what his alternatives were, although that said, I've read some behind-the-scenes commentaries that he hasn't been as forthcoming with negotiations as, for example, the socialists were looking for. So he may claim, from one side that, I'm putting you in front of your responsibilities, work together, or I'm out. On the other hand, was he truly trying the backroom dealings of negotiating with all the different parties? Hard to say. It looks like he did not want to find himself in the position of trying to, for lack of a better term, herd the cats of all the different parliamentary parties, the way Barnier did try to do. And, trying to please everyone meant that he pleased no one. So, I think it's interesting. I've read the idea and I've thought about the idea that it is in some ways similar to the gesture that Macron did in dissolving the parliament, where it's sort of a poker move, that it's a surprise. Macron called it throwing a bomb into the political sphere when he called those snap elections. Maybe it's the same thing.